Hey, I'm Craig Newmark. American democracy is under threat, and we all need to work together to protect the country and to protect our democracy. It's kind of like in World War II, when everyone was expected to play a role, and the first part of this is for all of us to learn a little more and to work together, strengthening American democracy, strengthening the country. The Civic Life series is a big part of that, and the 92nd Street Y, New York, is the right forum for delivering all that. I appreciate your joining me. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Farai Chideya. Today, we're honored to bring you a conversation about January 6th and how the investigation's revelations continue to reverberate today. We will introduce you to three of the Black and brown investigators whose brilliance and dedication helped to shore up the nation's democracy. Before we bring them in, a little bit about me. I've been a reporter for 33 years, and I've spent much of my time reporting on white supremacy and domestic violent extremism. As a Black woman doing this type of reporting, I've endured threats to my safety and come face to face with what it feels like in my body to sit in the back row of a Christian nationalist church which wanted to disinter the body of a mixed-race baby. I have walked through all sorts of communities in the country and brought back reporting which had a lot of foresight about what has become our present moment of political peril. I went into covering extremists in part because my family has a vibrant sense of our own history. One of my great-great-grandmothers was almost kidnapped by the patrollers or patty rollers who kidnapped free Blacks, especially children, as she was during the Civil War when this happened, into the Deep South. I have a number of family stories about positive interactions with white Americans and even systems, including the time a jury upheld my great-grandfather's property rights when he was challenged by a white man in Maryland. I knew that January 6th was going to be a seminal event, and my warnings, like those of other people of color, were ignored. We are honored today to have three of the investigators of color who dug deep into January 6th, 2021. They were on the front lines to save democracy. We're going to talk about where we are now as well, where we are in this series of investigations and examinations of the viability and protection of American democracy. I'd like to start out by asking our panelists to introduce themselves. Please state your full name and your role on the committee. Let's start with you, Samia.
Great, Farai. Thanks for having me. My name's Samia Dayananda. I'm currently a partner at Wilkie Farr and Gallagher in their investigations and enforcement practice. And on the committee, I was a senior investigative counsel where I led the inquiry into the law enforcement and military response leading up to and on January 6th.
Thank you so much. And Candace?
Hi, I'm Candace Phoenix. I was a senior counsel and senior advisor to the committee, and I wore a bunch of hats, but primarily I think I'm here mostly in my capacity as a senior investigative counsel leading the Purple team, which looked into the larger social dynamics that made January 6th possible.
And Marcus?
Hi, I'm Marcus Childress. I'm actually a partner-elect at the law firm of Jenner and Block that just happened recently.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And on my time on the committee, I was an investigative counsel on the Red team, but regularly talked to Samia and Candace, as I'm sure we'll talk about later in this conversation.
That sounds great. And you know, let me start out with a little bit of your backstories. Candace, let me start with you, because one of the things that definitely gives me some hurt feelings sometimes is when, in talking about domestic violent extremism, insurrection, and the role of white supremacy, as well as other issues in that, people assume that I'm just here to, I don't know, blame whiteness for everything. And the best reporters I know covering domestic violent extremism and its racial implications are white people who risk their lives every day, often in the communities of origin that they come from, going up against people who protest them with AR-15s, people who know their home address, et cetera. And so aside from my hurt feelings, one of the things I want to make clear here is when we talk about something like Christian nationalism, it's an ideology, not a religion. It's not Christianity. When we talk about white supremacy, it is not whiteness. White supremacy is also an ideology. And can you tell us about, from your backstory, the organization you were involved in that was a Black Jewish alliance in terms of understanding things? I think that gives people a sense of where you come from.
Sure. So I, in high school, in my junior and senior year, was part of a program called Operation Understanding DC, or OUDC for short. And it was comprised of, I believe at the time, 24 of us. There were 12 Jewish and 12 Black high schoolers. It was a year-long program that was meant to train us for social justice work. So we would spend the first, I believe it was 5 or 6 months or so, really learning about dynamics of white supremacy and racial history here in the United States, including with particular focus on African American history and on Jewish American history, but obviously looking at the other dynamics too with regards to immigration and other people of color. And then we would spend the summer doing a 3-week tour of the North and the South, going to all of the seminal civil rights landmarks, walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, going to the Lorraine Motel where MLK was killed, visiting all of the things that we would read about in the history books. And then we spent the last few months of the program learning how to translate all of that history into action, being trained on activism, on messaging, on how to do something with all of the knowledge that we had just gained. And that was a seminal experience for me because when I was in high school, I went to a mostly white, mostly rich private school, and I had a bit of an identity crisis, and I hadn't really been able to put the words to what that meant to be a Black student who was not of great financial means in a place like that. And being in a program like OUDC really helped me understand the larger history of the United States and the specific circumstances that I was in that led me to be a Black girl in a school where I was a pretty rare breed.
Yeah, absolutely. Marcus, what from your childhood or family's history fortified you in what ways as you did this work investigating January 6th?
So I actually don't know if I've shared this with Candace or Samia, but my grandparents played a huge role in my upbringing. So I come from a military family, but because of the nature of the military, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, both grandmothers. And I like to joke that if you want to understand my personality, you just have to look at what my grandmother let me do, which was watch C-SPAN during the day and then watch sports at night. And so I think growing up, I watched my fair share of congressional committee hearings. My grandmother would always talk about Black civil rights leaders, including Mr. Benny Thompson, Representative Bobby Scott, Whip Clyburn. Those were folks that my grandmother had a profound respect for. And then if you look at my other grandmother who I stayed with, it was a lot of Matlock and Murder, She Wrote. And so I don't know, it's just being on the committee, honestly, was, I felt truly blessed and humbled to kind of be able to live out both my grandmother's dreams, because they both loved the law and they both loved the political process and the legislative investigative process. And they passed away recently, right before I joined the committee. And so I felt like, I don't know, just an exuberance and just blessed to be able to kind of carry out such important work that I know that my son and grandchildren hopefully one day will study, just like I studied other investigations growing up.
Absolutely. And Samia, you, like me, were a childhood reader. You loved reading. And in your case, I was a fantasy. I was like, bring me all the dragons and hobbits. And what was your genre as a kid? And what does it say about you?
Yeah, I feel like when we spoke before, Farai, you had such great questions, and it really made me look back on my Nancy Drew obsession, which I guess really formed me in really unique ways considering my career path. So I would read Nancy Drew obsessively. I would watch Murder, She Wrote. I'm sure Marcus probably watched that show as well. And I just felt that problem solving in this manner was something that I really loved, whether it was in 60 Minutes with Angela Lansbury solving something or Nancy Drew chapter after chapter. So I was drawn to that, and that led me to being a DA and then being a federal prosecutor. And then the committee's work was really an extension of that problem solving, as well as just the longstanding public service commitment that I had.
And that's a perfect pivot for us. So you had worked on things like prosecuting El Chapo for financial crimes and, lots of big dog investigations before you got on this ultimate big dog investigation with January 6th. What did you walk in the door understanding was your role? And was that accurate, or did it change as you saw things coming together? Take us sort of inside the room.
Sure. So I had the advantage of having been a prosecutor for almost 20 years before moving to DC. And then I worked on a Senate committee on the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee, where I was when January 6th actually happened. So as a result of that, I kind of approached the Jan 6 committee from having, a small congressional investigation experience, but a vast prosecutor experience. But when I came through the door, it was a combination of both of those experiences that guided me in terms of how I wanted to approach the matter. So for the Senate report, we did a great bipartisan report that was solely focused on the security failures for January 6th. And it was important to me to be involved in the bigger story and the grander story. And that's exactly how the committee was set up. There were different teams. Candace mentioned the purple team that she led, and Marcus was on the red team that focused on the rioters' perspective. There was also the team that focused on the electors and the pressure on the vice president, the pressure on state electors, and then the team that followed the money. So that to me was very important, because on the Senate side, we weren't able to zoom out. And then once the vote failed, that there wasn't going to be a commission, and it felt that this was going to be the best substitute for it, it felt like a unique opportunity for me to combine that experience of understanding there are certain hurdles with the congressional investigation that I experienced on the Senate side, but also just purely taking it from a fact-finding mission, which is what, I think the committee from the investigative side did well.
And you led the blue team, which was looking at the response of military and law enforcement. What do you think? There's so many, there's so many findings, which is the kind of thing you get in a 750-page report. But give us an example of one finding that came out of what you did on the blue team.
I think that one of the findings was just generally how they could have prepared better. So I think for a legislative fix is really what you want the findings to be. It would be to make the joint session a national security event similar to the inauguration. It's called an NSSE. So that's something that there's reason to do that. There's many reasons, including that there's collaboration amongst the federal agencies, which is something that wasn't smooth on January 6th. There's a lead federal agency, typically the Secret Service, for those big national security events. So these are things that I think, in a typical congressional investigation, you look to see, you do a look back, you interview the key people, you review the key documents, and you think, okay, how can we congressionally fix this through legislation? And that was one of the recommendations that I think was necessary. And I don't know where it stands now in terms of whether that's actually passed, but it seemed like something that could get the bipartisan support that it needed.
Fantastic. Marcus, I was absolutely fascinated by your times of your stories about talking to Ali Alexander and Enrique Tarrio as part of your depositions. Both of them have fascinated me, but especially Tarrio because of the reporting I've done on, organizations or collectives, collectives like the 3 Percenters, which are not, an organization the same way that the Proud Boys has been. But now I'm getting into those weeds. So what was it like? Tell us who Enrique Tarrio is for the 3 people who don't know. And then what was it like to depose him along with your colleague Sandeep Prasanna? And it just seems to me like that is fun work and fraught work. I personally, I would have to be biting on my tongue so hard. You must have so much self-restraint to have done this work. Tell us about it.
So Enrique Tarrio was the prior chairman, head of the Proud Boys. This was one of the examples in the committee where, Samia and Candace mentioned earlier that our teams work together a lot. And this was one of those opportunities where the red team and the purple team led by Candace, where we took this deposition together, and from different angles, which actually highlighted, I think, how effective we were as a committee in approaching witnesses to get different information that would lead to findings and recommendations on the back end. So the purple team really focusing on the Proud Boys ideology, their messaging leading up to January 6th. And then my team, the red team, coming in and talking about, the facts leading up, maybe January 4th, 5th, 6th, that time period, and their role on that day. In terms of actually talking to Enrique Tarrio, and I'd actually love to hear Candace's impression too, because she was in the room that entire day. I didn't really find it hard to remain restrained with him. I think a lot of that has to come from the military background and upbringing, and also just, being an investigator, right? He wasn't, I wouldn't even say even closest to the baddest person I've ever talked to in an interview room, if we're being completely candid. And I think that just goes back to my training as a JAG prosecutor and South in the Middle District, where I started out investigating motorcycle gangs, 1%er gangs, guys that were, in my opinion, really, really inflicting violence in our local community. And someone, Enrique Tarrio, who I found to be more of a politician whose messaging had a profound impact on rioters. And so the main takeaway that I had from the deposition that I found interesting, that I don't think I necessarily expected, was he started out relatively disciplined per se for a witness, like not really answering questions or really wanting to engage. But you could also tell he wanted to get his story out in a way that allowed us to effectively put documents in front of him and really go through the timeline and get something on paper, right, to lock him into a story, to a testimony. And I found that to be one of the more successful parts of our deposition, was one, just having him say what he did and what his role was leading up to January 6th. I found it to be one of the successful parts of documenting the historical record return to January 6th.
Yeah, and it's he was not even in town on January 6th, because he'd already been thrown out for a different incident in advance, and he still got 22 years in prison. I know that it's impossible for you to know whether he expected that, but what comes to mind for me was, as he was talking to you, not that your deposition was the only factor which sort of led up to his getting 22 years in prison, but it was certainly part of the freight train. Do you think that someone like Tarrio might have imagined that that the bus would stop for him at the jail doors, as at the prison doors, with that much time?
It's hard to tell. I think one thing you could definitely tell from him, this is just my impression, it was virtual, right? So it's kind of like this conversation where I read the room. I definitely got the I'm the smartest guy in the room impression from him, which I think can lead to problems for you when you're testifying before folks who have experience conducting investigations. And I think not being at the Capitol on January 6th is something that a couple big name defendants have referenced as they go through these criminal trials. But with the conspiracy, as we all know, you don't necessarily have to have, shot the gun or shot the weapon, right? I think it was important, and we established it during our deposition, that and Tarrio was in the Ministry of Self-Defense group chats. He was part of mobilizing Proud Boys and other organizations to come to Stop the Steal rallies from the election all the way through January 6th, and actually coming to DC on January 6th. And the jury found that to be enough beyond a reasonable doubt to convict him for those crimes. So I do think, though, that he definitely gave off smartest man in the room type vibes. And I think that we were, including Sandeep, who did a masterful job as well at staying calm, keeping it professional, asking very pointed questions, and repeating those questions until Mr. Tarrio answered them. I think that was one of the more successful parts of our time with him.
Yeah. And Candace, turning to you, your team collaborated on this specific deposition, but you wore a couple of different hats on the investigation, and you were riding herd over a lot. Give me an example of something that stands out to you about your time serving the committee that just, is an example of the kind of work you did that you feel has meaning or hope has meaning, and want to share it with us.
Well, I think just staying on the Tarrio deposition, I agree with Marcus that he had the sense that he was the smartest person in the room. I think in a lot of rooms he's in, he probably is, which is one of the scariest things. He's not a stupid man. He's very charismatic, and I think that's what makes him so dangerous. But it was near the end of his deposition when we started talking about, well, what's the next step of this movement? And I can't remember exactly what the phrasing was, but essentially his answer was, well, we have to go hyper local. We have to start working with folks to really go advocate at their school boards and take over their local elections. And that was to me one of the clearest pieces of evidence that we had, that January 6th itself might have stood out as a particularly violent event, but it was of a piece of a much longer, still rolling effort to enforce white supremacy up and down government at all levels and in so-called respectable ways. Because we see that with the Moms Demand Liberty or other groups like that are working at the local level in Florida, where Tarrio was, to enforce some of the same ideologies that Tarrio followed. And so that to me was what was a piece that I don't know that's gotten very much attention in the January 6th discussion, but it's critically important because it also shows that the problem is not just Trump. He is a core metastasization of that ideology, but it's very diffuse. That movement is diffuse, and that makes it so much more dangerous. And it means that the solutions we have to talk about are very different.
Yeah, I mean, when we started this conversation, I talked about some of the reporters I know who are doing frontline work, in local communities. And that's where I see a lot of things popping off. They're tracking things like, did someone come and threaten violence at a drag brunch or a drag story hour? Did someone threaten violence against people from A, B, or C backgrounds? And I think that we know that, like our reporting goes in heavy on race, in part because race is part of the foundational structure of American society in legal ways that many other things are not. But we also talk about the transphobia, Islamophobia, homophobia, and anti-Semitism that are embedded in a number of the movements. Like you and I talked about QAnon, and how QAnon has a chassis of anti-Semitism that a lot of people don't know about. But, as we pivot from talking a bit about the investigations to talking about the current state of play and the broader implications, what has it been like, and I'm going to ask this of each of you, to begin to watch the seemingly endless array of indictments, to also watch certain people beginning to plead out in some of the cases related to the former president, particularly in Georgia, to see other people stand defiantly and be cited, like Rudy Giuliani regarding Shea Moss and the larger question of whether he endangered their lives and defamed them, which the court resoundingly said yes to. I mean, there's been news. There's been a lot of news. So I'm going to run the tables with the three of you, but starting with you, Candace, give me an example of one thing that stood out from this endless array of news and how it relates to the work that you've done.
Well, first, I just want to address what we were just saying about all the other types of isms that are wrapped up in this larger movement. I think that's one of the reasons why we try to be disciplined about talking about white supremacy, because white supremacy does include misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, all those different isms, in a way that just talking about race does not. And we had lots of folks on our team who were not of color, but are LGBTQ or are Jewish or are women, who also had their own experiences being on this committee and dealing with some of these larger trends. But in terms of the direct question about what it's been like to watch these cases go forward, I have a mix of fatalism and hope all together. On the one hand, I've just been so happy to finally see something approaching accountability because as much as reporting and congressional investigations are important, they can't mete out discipline. And unless there are actual consequences for real people who do this conduct, we will not see it slide off at all moving forward. So I've been happy about that. I've been disturbed, though, about how much that seems to harden people's camps where they already were. I think there was a hope. I don't know that I shared that hope, but there was a lot of hope early on about how if you had accountability, that could change the public's hearts and minds, and that there is some persuadable middle that would have a different view on January 6th once they started seeing the jail sentences. And I think instead people are gravitating towards the narratives that they were already predisposed to. So I'm really glad that DOJ and that other entities have really stepped up and have started holding people accountable. I'm worried, though, that accountability, which we have as a country just so relied on, is not going to be enough.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say I worry about that too. I'm not surprised in the sense that, I've done 30 years of field reporting, and part of that was covering the rise of candidate Trump in the 2016 cycle, and to begin to see the reasons why people voted for him. I'll just call out my industry. Media completely blew it. As we know, well, maybe not completely. Okay, not completely, but the press gave candidate Trump more free media in the primary than all the other Republican candidates combined. That is not a problem with democracy that's out on some ice floe. That's a problem with the American media that would rather make a buck, and it's certainly not everyone, than do journalism that actually gets to the heart of the matter. And just to reiterate my financial comments, now disgraced former CBS head Les Moonves said on 2 different earnings calls that Trump wasn't good for America, but he was good for CBS. So if you're looking for a smoking gun on the financial intent side of media's misconduct, that's just the one that actually made it out of the earnings calls because someone was horrified enough to report it to the press twice, 2 different earnings calls. He said it a second time. So don't give me no nothing, right? But all of which is to say, I feel like the press is largely getting things right now in a way it didn't in the 2016 cycle, but it's kind of too late. It's too late for us to have the impact that we think we have as journalists on helping people make rational decisions. So that is Farai on the soapbox. Farai off the soapbox. I'm going to turn to you, Marcus. What is it like to see the cascade of indictments and think about your role and the committee's role in where we are now, and where are we now? And of course, Samia, going to you next.
So I said this when we were chatting earlier, but it's really tough going after Candace because I was going to say accountability as well. That's just been something that I think provides the hope, to be completely frank. One thing that's really stood out to me is the lack of actual pushback on our factual findings. Right? I think it's almost like, and I hate to be wonky, lawyer wonk, but it's almost like we've got the record, the factual record is established. And all of the debate has been about what do we do from here, right? Can presidents be held accountable? Do they have absolute immunity? What Brady disclosures, things of that nature.
So no, yeah, sorry about that. I should have muted myself. It was so why don't we pick up from the start of that question? I think it's easier than dealing with the motorcycle. So I'll just say the very end of the question, what do you think about all those I'll do it better for the camera.
No worries at all. And I'll make my joke of Candace again.
No. Please don't let a motorcycle ruin a perfectly good taping. So Marcus, what is it like to watch the cascade of indictments and to think about the role that the work of the committee and your work on that committee might have played in the state of play today?
So I said this when we were chatting earlier, but it's always hard to follow Candace because my word was also accountability. And it gives me hope, right, that folks are being held accountable, whether it be in civil trial or for criminal indictments for their roles leading up to and on January 6th. I think one of my biggest takeaways is that there's been a lack of pushback on the factual record, right? So that there are factual findings that came from the January 6th committee we've seen incorporated into indictments, whether it was directly or through their own independent investigations, whether it been a special counsel, Fulton County, other places. We've seen our factual record relied upon and not really people pushing back on what we found. I think now the debate, which is probably the scary part, is that we're trying to figure out who our laws are applicable to, right? Is it applicable to a former president? Does obstruction of a official proceeding apply to people who are storming the Capitol, which seems like an obvious application, or is it only related to Enron evidence tampering, which seems like a overly narrow view of the statute? So I think we're now kind of getting in the nitty-gritty legal nuances of accountability rather than the factual record, which I think all of us here are trial attorneys, and I like my hand when people are making legal arguments versus pushing back on what I've found factually. So in that way, I think we are in a good spot. And I think that is hopefully what the legacy of the committee is, right? No one's really questioning the record of that day. And I'm not sure if I would have thought that would be true when I was on the committee afterwards, right? I don't think I could have thought of a more optimistic outlook on the committee than, no one questioning the facts that we established.
Yeah, yeah. And Samia, one thing that comes to mind for me as we started, writing up the documentary and thinking about what context we needed to put in was that in the First Amendment, protected speech includes peaceful protest. January 6th obviously was not a peaceful protest and is, in my opinion, and I'm sure the opinion of people with actual law degrees much smarter than me, you cannot look at January 6th and consider it in the same vein of peaceful protest as protected in the Constitution. It strikes me that also matters when you're looking at the response of military and law enforcement and what they expected to happen on that day. But now that we do know what happened on that day and that we've gotten, I would say beyond it, but we haven't gotten beyond it, but we are at least temporarily beyond it. How in what ways are we still in it? Meaning, in what ways do you think, from your vantage point as having been a team lead, that we're still kind of investigating and pulling threads out of January 6th, and where does it land and where your attention lands at this point?
Sure. So I'm going to answer the last question.
I know, sorry. It was one of those ones where I'm just like, I just want to know all the things, basically, how is everything relevant today? That's another.
I will answer both, but I will say that for me, in terms of the last question about what these indictments have meant, I think it's validating, and that echoes what both Candace and Marcus have said, right? They have affirmed what the path was laid out by the committee in terms of the facts. And I think that is affirming for the work that we've done, considering we couldn't provide the accountability, as Candace said. But I will say, I don't believe this is accountability yet, right? It's just an indictment, and that will come if there is a conviction on any of these matters. But it struck me that when Candace said that there's mixed emotions, I think 4 months ago in August, when the Jack Smith indictment came out, there was a moment of joy, I think, for a lot of committee staff members of okay, this is what we've been waiting for, because the congressional committee can only get so far. But the mixed emotions come in now when it's December and the former president is polling at 60% and at all looks like he will be the nominee. So it's hard to reconcile those emotions, because yes, there could still even be accountability. There could still be a guilty verdict and he could still be the nominee and ultimately the president. So it's very hard to reconcile those feelings. But I will answer your direct question.
My second of 57 questions, you mean?
So I think that, one of the subject matters is this concept of First Amendment protected speech. And in the majority of interviews that were conducted, there was this mantra from law enforcement personnel that this was a First Amendment protected speech, but it's not really understanding, zooming out on the events that led up to it, right? That the folks were fed a lie that the election was stolen. Certainly they have the right to protest that, but it's, to me, the combination of the lie itself and then what the conduct turned into. It went from at certain times when you're just gathering on the ellipse, peaceful protest, to an outright riot. So I take issue with thinking that that's some sort of, there's blurriness there. There's not. I mean, we all saw the protests over the summer in 2020. Those were, again, protests, but there were certain aspects that people blew up that turned into a riot. And of course, the response from the administration at that time, the Trump administration, did treat it like it was an outright riot, and it certainly wasn't. And actually, in the data that came out months later, it was 97% peaceful. So I think that in terms of where you go from here, it's having, at least from a law enforcement perspective, understanding what the difference is and understanding that what the impact of language can be. So in interview after interview, when you showed, parlor posts of, we're going to storm the riot, here's the tunnels, here's the maps, here's the date, when we're going to do it, there was a response, well, that was protected speech and it wasn't specific or credible enough. So my hope is that law enforcement takes this moment to recognize that folks who are supporters, who could be historically supporters of law enforcement, supporters of the person in charge, can still and have shown to be violent. And when they are saying things that are in numbers, and when looked at, again, from zooming out, thousands of people are saying the same thing over and over again, I hope that law enforcement takes them seriously. And obviously there's an aspect of race there, right? So if these were brown and black people posting the same things that we saw on Parler, would it have been taken differently from law enforcement? And that's something that they really need to have a moment on and discuss internally of how they're going to deal with the next January 6th event, whether it's at state capitals or in their local precincts. But simply because of who that group is, the word should be taken more seriously, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I've also been fascinated by the way that my tribe, again, the journalist, has begun tentatively using words like fascism to describe what could happen during a second Trump presidency. And this was language, I mean, there have been many developments in how the former president has directly spoken about changes he wants to make to the government that are much more clearly autocratic. But it's not as if I wouldn't even call it subtext, but it's not as if the text wasn't there before. It just appears to have crossed a line that the media is more comfortable calling out. What do you think we need to understand, Candace? And this is another one of my big loopy questions, but what do you think we, meaning those people informed enough to tune in here to the 92nd Street Y, who obviously care about society and are proud to be part of a learning journey about where we are today. What do you think we need to know to go into this era in history better prepared? What would you be reading or suggesting people read or just think about?
So I think there are a lot of experts that we on the Purple team consulted leading up to drafting our versions of the report internally. Some of those were experts on social media, some were experts on law enforcement, some were experts on militias and white supremacy, and some were experts on democracy. And there are a number of expert reports that were submitted to the committee that were not in the final report, but have been posted online. I believe they're in a clearinghouse for just security that clearinghouse is a wealth of information about the warning signs that the prior Trump administration put up and what to look for moving forward. They're by authors who wrote, I'm terrible with names, so I'm going to forget them, but I know that there are books like How Democracies Die, or even Stuart Stevens' book, It Was All a Lie. Those books will tell you, like, what are the hallmarks of a democracy? What have we seen around the world and in our own history within this country that are warning signs for what's to come? Because I think there is this sense that of American exceptionalism, that what's happened in other countries can't happen here, or that what happens in other countries, when it happens here, it's different, or we're going to talk about it differently and not accept the outcomes. But, there are countries around the world that call themselves democracies that the United States would never consider a democracy, because there are populations there that can't vote, or that the right to suffrage isn't real or substantive. And there's a danger that America could slide into that same category, but because of our sense of self, we're not going to admit that we're not a democracy.
We are the
I
frog
think,
in the water that's getting to boil.
Right. And I think there's also this sense of what's happening on January 6th and what's happening now is brand new. And it is both new because it's taking a new form, but it is also part of a cycle that this country has gone through consistently, when there are periods of protest and progress, and then backlash and re-entrenchment. And I think we need to both understand our history to understand this moment in America, but also understand global history and in the history of democracy, just to learn the lessons of what we're seeing overseas. I know one of the whistleblowers that we talked to who worked at Facebook would tell us that Facebook would learn lessons about how political movements were operating overseas and how they needed to handle the platform more responsibly. But they would only apply that lesson to the country where they learned it. And they wouldn't, pull back and apply those same lessons elsewhere. And that meant that they were not ready when January 6th came, because they had not learned the lesson broader than the very specific circumstance that it happened in. And I think the broader story of America and January 6th is kind of the same, that we can look around the world and see what's happening in other countries, but we won't learn the lesson for ourselves. We'll just learn that it's specific to that particular country overseas. And I think we as a nation need to get better at that. So I would recommend that folks who are looking to understand all the different angles would take a look at that Just Security Clearinghouse. There are expert opinions on just about anything you can imagine regarding January 6th there that will give you a real set of expertise about that event in particular and what to look out for moving forward.
And I will say that it was such a joy to learn from you about these assets, which, are informally called the Book of Purple. And, there are people like former New Jersey Governor Christy Todd Whitman, who are among those who've contributed material. So it's not just coming from the political left, et cetera. And I think that that's important. And I'm sure that it was not an accident that you included experts on these issues that cut across some of the American political divides. But I want to pick up on something else you're saying and turn to Samia. As someone who has a transnational family, where my father was from Zimbabwe and I have relatives in Europe, many different parts of Africa, in the US, et cetera, you are also from a transnational family. In my case, one of my parents was an immigrant. In your case, both of your parents were immigrants and professors. What is it like, as someone from a transnational family, to look at the global moves towards authoritarianism and some of the global patterns that Candace was hinting at?
So I think it's interesting, like, looking at what's happening in India now with a leader who some people love and some people have legitimate reasons to be very, very troubled by. And I think there are parallels there in the treatment of minorities and the treatment of the policies, that there are conversations where you can draw that link between how the former president ran the country and how he intends to if elected again, and the current prime minister of India. So that is a real example of the global problem that we're facing, but more so it's the perception. So, when you have family that lives outside of the US, they're almost able to pierce through what's happening in a way, in a blunt manner that I think that we living here aren't able to see and actually look in the mirror. When Trump was elected, my cousin who lives in London came to visit that night of the election and was like, everyone saying he's going to win. I was like, absolutely not. There's no way we're going to be toasting at 9 p.m. This is going to be the best thing ever, to go from President Obama to, Hillary Clinton. It's great. Well, it felt like the joke was on me because she literally
she called it.
In London, called it. And, does she have different information? Maybe, but more so it's the perception of what was happening. And I think that that's something that, to Candace's point of taking a look back of what led to it, a lot of it was this frustration from many people who voted for Trump, that the fact that there was a Black man that was elected president, and the inevitability almost that something like this could happen. I think it's something that other outside of the US people could see more clearly than we could.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had a heck of a time in my newsroom during the 2016 cycle, which was 538, convincing my colleagues that Trump was a viable candidate in the primaries and later in the general election. And I was out there in the field. My beat was voter demographics and data. And I was like, yeah, but let me tell you why. What I'm seeing out here is they're literally better organized. The ground game was so much better from Trump 2016 in many places I visited. And part of that was that they gave real agency to their local party representatives to do whatever they could to speak to their constituents, whereas the Clinton campaign's messaging was very top down in ways that didn't always translate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, I was on air on ABC's digital channel from 10 p.m. till 3 a.m. People were literally passing out at the supposed victory party for Hillary Clinton, passing out from stress and ambulances being called. And people would be texting me yeah, this is happening out there in the world. And I'm like, yeah, I'm still in the studio. We'll be here for a while. I wasn't shocked by it. I didn't think that Trump would win in the sense that I was like, he's a shoo-in, but I was like, he's got a better ground game. I know why people are voting for him. He's totally a viable candidate. And so I was not shocked when he won. And I was frustrated that, again, I really do love being a journalist, or I wouldn't be doing it. But I was frustrated again that we didn't do a better job. But I'm going to pivot to something very different for you, Marcus, which is the military. The military is a big part of your life. You were literally born into a military family. You became a JAG, or military prosecutor. And we, in January 6th, did see a number of veterans show up for team insurrection. What was it like to also focus as part of the Red Team on the rioters and recognize that you had something in common with many of them? And what do you make of that? And what do you make of it now, as we look at not so much obviously the indictments, et cetera. It's not there are many people who have military backgrounds who've been convicted, but what is the big picture moving ahead for how we should think about the role of military and civil society around protecting democracy and the complexities of that? And I know that was also another 17 questions in one, so choose what you can.
Yeah, so I think if you go back, unfortunately, a lot of the interviews of rioters that our team conducted were military veterans. And it was a card that I played every time we met with them, was talking about where I was stationed, being a third generation Air Force kid, just trying to find some type of common ground with folks that I probably didn't have that much in common with. I think what I went back on was that when I was in the military, it was almost like an echo chamber of media that we used or that was on around base. It was always Fox News, if I'm just being completely honest. And so leading up to 2016, I was actually stationed in Middle Georgia, and my wife and I joked that we would call back our friends in DC and New York and be like, I don't know what you guys are seeing, but this Trump guy's going to win. Like, I have no idea what's going on, but there's just an enthusiasm in the South that I've never had experienced before. Fast forward to when I was speaking with rioters and folks that had stormed the Capitol that were military veterans, one of the themes that came out, and Mr. Kinzinger always hit on this, was commander-in-chief, right? If the commander-in-chief is saying something, then who am I to question it? And even one guy went so far to say, you know, President Obama had told you that the election was stolen. Wouldn't you believe it? I'm not sure that is necessarily the case for me, right? I think we would look for some type of evidence or facts, even if someone that we loved in the political world said something, but it's a good point, right? And I think that military folks in particular are literally drilled and brainwashed through boot camp to take orders from superior officers, including the commander-in-chief. And do I think that is the reason why folks believed what former President Trump was saying? No, I think that's a little bit of a free pass, but I do think that is part of what was going on. I think the bigger issue, and this goes back to the media point, with the echo chambers of where individuals were receiving their information. So, and in the beginning of every deposition or interview with rioters, we would ask questions about where they got their media from. And this is, it was a line of questioning that we worked with Candace's team to make sure we included. And, you know, we would go through all of the major media sources, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, all of them. And what we found was that even Fox News was considered too mainstream for a lot of the folks. So they might have been military, but they were getting their news from InfoWars or from Parler or other extreme sites or programs. And I think that had more to do with it than the necessarily military aspect of it. But it was, for me, particularly kind of sad that it felt like military folks and veterans were being targeted by these media platforms as, you know, representing who they are and representing what they want in our country. I do want to end by saying this, that I do think the military folks who stormed the Capitol or were involved with this, I don't think that represents the majority of our military, to be candid. One of the things that bothers me is the lack, when we think of military, we don't think of the diversity and the diverse groups within the military, right? If you look at the enlisted corps, it's very representative of the United States, right? In terms of racial demographics, the officer corps has a lot of work to do, but the military in general, I think we, just like when we talk about evangelicals and Christians, I'm a Southern Christian Baptist guy. When we're talking about that group, we're not talking about us Christians, we're talking about a certain group of Christians. And I want to make sure that I am not mistakenly talking about, right, all military, talking about a certain group of military folks who I think are able to be preyed on by the former president.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a family where my family's military history, my cousin, who was an Apache pilot in Afghanistan, is the person who's youngest in my family to serve, and our family line in the military goes back to the Civil War, goes through the World Wars and Korea and, you know, Vietnam, and, you know, and also my family is ideologically diverse, where some of my military relatives as well as non-military relatives were or are conservative or Republican. And I say definitely are conservative, and as to whether or not they consider themselves Republicans anymore, I haven't done a check, because I don't want them to think I'm just like Farai, the reporter relative, like, so hey, how did that whole, you know, Trump thing, and I think I know the answer, but it's different from actually getting my relatives to answer. So again, I digress. But as we wrap up here, and it's the time has flown by, partially because I ask very long questions, but partially because you're all so brilliant. And so I'll start with you, Marcus. Like, First of all, do you think that we are still in January 6th? I don't mean that it's literally January 6th, the way that some people would argue that the pandemic was only one day long, but it lasted for years. You know what I mean? I don't mean that. I mean, where are we today is January 6th still a sort of a vital place to put our civic energy into understanding, and why, and kind of where are we? And I'm going to leave that as the final question for all of you, but starting with you, Marcus.
Yeah, I'm so happy I get to answer this question before Candace and Samia, because I would have been like what they said. So I don't think that January 6th and the validity of the election is being litigated. I think that has been put to bed. I think there's a small minority of Americans who will still say the election might have been stolen, but I think to a large extent, I might be overly optimistic, which Candace will tell me afterwards I am being. I think that is not being litigated anymore. Look, I told you at the beginning, and I've told you before, my grandmother in particular made me really look at congressional investigations in the past. And I'm hoping, this is my hope, is that, you look back at the biggest, probably first congressional investigation with the Teapot Dome, one back in the 1920s, where, Congress really looked into it, really established the facts. Special counsels were appointed, and then individuals were prosecuted on the back end. This is the natural kind of course of how these things play out when you have a team led by folks like Samia and Candace that lead the team with the fact finding, or even maybe like the Watergate investigation, where we're talking about presidential immunity, but yet President Nixon felt the need to accept a pardon because he knew that he wasn't immune from all crimes that he might have committed in office. I'm hoping that's where we eventually land. I think in history we look at the back end of how these things resolved rather than how rocky it was in the interim. And I think, look, we're in a rocky interim right now, but I'll keep going back to the point that whether President Biden was lawfully elected is not being litigated. It's just now, what do we do now, right? And that is a very difficult political question, and we're dealing with a very persuasive politician who is at the core of these unfounded claims and of criminal liability. I am hopeful that we will get through it, but 2024 will be a very critical year, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic in whether we still are the America that we think we are. And I think that is something that we're all kind of anxiously probably waiting for.
No, absolutely. I mean, and Samia, I'm going to turn to you next. Like Marcus, you are the parent of young children, in his case, one child, in your case, two children. And I can't help but think about your role as a mother, in addition to all the other roles that you've played in life, all these professional roles and your family history and law school and all that. You are also playing the starring role of mother to your children. How do you think about the vitality of January 6th as a line of inquiry, as you think about it as a mother as well as a legal expert?
Yeah, so I think, I agree with Marcus that I do think this is well beyond, was the election stolen? I think it is an unfortunate vehicle that led people there, and people were exploited. But I do think the bigger picture is, why does this person who speaks in such violent language and is so anti-immigrant and anti-people of color and anti-people almost, just why does this person have 60% of support? So I think, to your question of as a citizen, as a lawyer who wants the rule of law to prevail, as a former prosecutor, as a mother, you have a moment of where is this country going to, right? So I think that is where the conversation should shift. Instead of focusing so much on the former president, it's why. It's what, Candace's team this is the heart of what they were looking into. Why are they is he getting so much support? So when I think about, from a very personal point of next November, if this man is elected president and I am here with my young children, who cares if I was a former Jan 6 staffer? That will be a very troubling moment across this country. And it will really be, I think, a moment of reckoning for all people, but particularly people of color, who had a hope that this country was moving forward.
Yeah, thanks so much, Samia. And Candace, I'm going to turn to you to round it out. You know, we have of the episodes of our podcast, January 6th, An American Story, which you all are the stars of. We did one of our first 5 episodes. The 6th episode is very much sort of like a broad view. And the first 5 episodes are very much inside the work that you did on the committee. And also we interviewed Representatives Thompson and Raskin and former Representative Kinzinger for one of the episodes. But one of them is on the Book of Purple, the material that you worked on, most of which didn't make it into the final report. As you look, first of all, the question I've been asking everyone of like, what is vital about January 6th that is ongoing at this point, but also what is vital about work like the Book of Purple that is ongoing at this point?
Well, it's my turn to say, darn it, I wish I wasn't going last, because what Samia and Marcus said was brilliant. I mean, I think the thing I've been struck by as someone who studied history a lot is how much we as people try to really define events around inflection points, and how our narrative about history is really built around those points, but how when you're living through it, it's a much longer process and a much longer tale. And I think it's a mistake to think of January 6th as in the past or dealt with. It certainly was an inflection point, and the very specific threat from that day is done. But I think the long tail of the big lie of January 6th itself is going to and already has fractured into so many different directions that has permeated just about every part of our society. And that's not new or surprising, nor should it be. It makes it difficult to confront because there are so many different permutations that continue to draw their origin in January 6th. But it also means that we can't be lazy about it. You know, there's also this sense of looking back at history that the progress that has been made is inevitable. I know I felt that way for a long time, that, you know, that quote of the progress, what was it, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I just sort of assumed from all of my studies that things naturally over time get better. And I think we have to recognize that January 6th shows that that's not naturally true, that it requires people to actively work to bend that arc towards justice. And that means that we as society have to have a holistic understanding of what happened on January 6th. And it's too simplistic just to think about the very specific items around the big lie or the violence of that day. The seeds of the big lie were planted long before anybody really thought of Trump as a political figure. And we've likened on the committee, and I think I've told you this before, Farai, likened Trump almost to Thanos in some ways, that there are these infinity stones of white supremacy and voter suppression and issues with law enforcement and props of social media that he came and he picked up and put them all together to punch the Capitol on January 6th. But none of those underlying causes have really been dealt with. And to Samia's point, so long as he and his movement continue to command the attention of the American people, we're not out of the woods.
Yeah. Well, that is a perfect place to leave it. And what I will say, folks, is I have never been prouder of work that I've done in my professional career as doing this documentary. Of course, it's not perfect because nothing in life ever is. If I had no personal responsibilities and no job responsibilities, I could have spent a year doing this and et cetera, but it's pretty darn good. And y'all might want to check it out on our podcast feed. I could not be more thrilled and more proud to have worked on our documentary. It's available online at the Our Body Politic feed on any podcatcher of choice, OUR Body Politic. 6 episodes, including with Chairman Benny Thompson, Representative Benny Thompson, Representative Jamie Raskin, former Representative Adam Kinzinger, who talks about what it was like to leave a party which had left him. I mean, he brought his gun to the Capitol on January 6th because he expected violence, and now people are trying to kill him still because they perceive him as a traitor to American democracy because he stood up for democracy. These are the stakes that we're living with, and they're stakes that affect people of all races and genders. They affect people who aren't even in the United States, because what happens in the United States affects what happens in the world. And I think all three of you, Samia, Marcus, and Candace, have given us a great perspective on why your work is so vitally important today and moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Farai.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.